Good evening, everybody. If you can hear me, let me see a thumbs up. Thank you. Welcome back to EDL 707, using data for school improvement. Happy Valentine's Day. I hope every one of you has someone that you love a whole lot and that loves you back this time of year. Don't forget to tell them. I posted for you the other day in the discussion forum a prompt about your final exam. So you got a precursor to that, a little practice run. And in that, when I posted that, you saw I gave you the entire final exam. So that'll be due on the last day of class, which is March the 9th, week 7. By the way, week 7, we will not have a Zoom session. Instead, you'll have the final exam, but I'm giving you the final exam right here at the midway point, and you can start working on it already. You can have it done pretty much before week 7 starts, except there'll be some important stuff coming at you in week 7. As is our practice, let me say this again. Our week 7, I think you've seen this. The structure of week 7 is exactly like all the other weeks. I will open the module for week 7 a little bit early for you, so you can, if you want to, you can work ahead, because on week 7, your due dates are Saturday night instead of Sunday night. LSU makes me turn my grades in at 10 a.m. on Monday morning. So let's see, what do I have? I've got about 110 of you in academic courses and about 70 of you in internship stuff, so I can't get it all done on Sunday night. So you'll need to turn that stuff in on Saturday night, March the 9th, in week 7. But as is our practice during these Zoom sessions, not really a lecture on my part, although tonight I am going to share something with you that you might consider using as professional development whenever you become a campus assistant principal or someone in charge of professional development. And a few comments from me, and then I'll answer questions if you got them. So here we go. My thoughts and comments in relation to what's been going on in the course this last week or so. The data skeptic thing, when we talked about data's fallacies, you had some great stories and some content related to when data either causes some false assumptions or creates some negative work or just out and out misleads people. Sometimes people use data for that. But and I purposefully framed 1 week around a conversation of how data sometimes causes us to run off the track instead of heads us in the right direction. I want you to be skeptics, but I don't want you to be cynics. A skeptic is going to look very critically and question. A cynic can't hardly be convinced to change their mind. So I want you to be skeptical. I want you to be critical and very careful about what data you choose. And we'll talk about collection. That's what's going on this week, data collection. But as many of you have noted in the discussion forum, the time we have is very finite. And there's no way we can disaggregate, crunch, dig into all the data that we have available to us. So we have to be very selective in choosing the data that helps us get to the goals that we've chosen as important enough for our efforts. Always, we're looking for authentic and reliable data, and that's why I drug you through that fallacy stuff this week, is because some data is not worthy of our time. But I want to draw an analogy with you, if you'll suffer my indulgence here. Most of you track your personal health somehow. It may be on how you feel, or you may take your blood pressure regularly, or You may feel like your resting pulse rate is the great marker, indication of how healthy you are. But most of you monitor your personal health somehow. You know better than I do whether or not the data that you collect, whether it's your resting pulse rate or your blood pressure, is an accurate, or you know how much flexibility you have, is an accurate and worthy data set for you to make evaluations of your health. But my wife and I, in the last year, have started getting regular blood drawn because from what we've been learning about our health is that the blood markers, when you get that full blood panel and you learn about what all those things in your blood are, it's a pretty damn good data set. That gives you a very holistic picture of your health. And I'm not trying to convince you to get a blood panel, but I want you to shift to your thinking to schools as a living, breathing organism, because you are responsible for the health and well-being of your body. It's a tremendous gift that you've been given. Once you and I move into positions of campus principal or superintendent, now not only are we responsible for the health and well-being of our body, we're responsible for the health and well-being of that living organism that we call that school or that campus or that school district. We need to figure out what the good data measurements are that give us the best view of the holistic health and well-being of that organization, so we can take intervention steps and action steps to address any areas where the health and well-being may be compromised. But bottom line is this: data is just a tool. The data is just a tool. And here, to reinforce that, I want to show you, I got a bucket out of my barn. Can you see my bucket here? It's my tool bucket. So you and I, as the educators on our campus, whether we're in teaching or whether we're assistant principal or superintendent role, and we have a lot of tools at our disposal. Data is one of them. And there's a lot of kind of tools that are available to us. But at the end of the day, you and I are responsible for securing the learning. Both with the students that we serve and for the adults that are working with us. So let's take an analogy here. Here's a tool. Can you see what that is? Can you see that that's a screwdriver? Somebody nod. Okay. That's a tool. Most of us know how to use that tool. But if you think of it in terms of professionals, this tool was made to turn screws, to secure something. As professional educators, we're securing the learning. But that tool only works if it's on a slot-headed screw, right? Unless you're using this tool to pry something open. You can do that. Sometimes we compromise, improvise, not compromise. We improvise and we use a tool for something it was not designed to do. Sometimes we dig in the garden with it. But at the end of the day, as professionals, we need to know, well, not only do we need to have this tool in our tool chest, but we need to know how to use it and when it's appropriate to use it. Here's another one. This also is a screwdriver. I don't know if you can see. Can you see the head of that thing? That's a Phillips screwdriver. Won't work on a slot-headed screw. You can try, but it won't work. It only works on screws that have a Phillips head. And in this particular one, it's a pretty good size one. It's not one that you could use on your glasses because it's far too big. But if securing the learning is what we're responsible for doing, then we could use this tool to secure under the right conditions and with the right products. Another tool that we might have in our tool chest, that one is a monster, okay? But that's a screwdriver, like the other two. It's a screwdriver, and it's designed to secure, but it takes a very specific kind of screw and requires quite a lot of force to use this one. And there's a lot of screws, more screws than not, that this would not work on because it's too big. Another screwdriver. Oh, I'm digging in my bucket here. Now this one is another screwdriver. I don't know if you can see the head, but it's a screwdriver. But watch. Listen to this. It's a ratchet. So now we can run the screw faster. But this one, I purposely put the bit on here. This is a square-headed bit, so it would not work with a slot-headed bit. So there's certain screws that this would not work on. In fact, there's a very limited number of screws that this would work on. But because of this ratcheting effect, we can actually get more work done faster under the right conditions and with the right audience that we would be working with. We could secure the learning with that baby. Let me see what else I got in my bucket here. Oh yeah. If we're in the business of really trying to make a lot of learning happen and secure a lot of learning, then here we go. We got it now. Power. Now we can secure a lot of learning with, and this happens to be a cordless tool, not even a big one. In my barn, I got some big ones, some big drills, but notice that these have interchangeable. So this one has a hex head bit. So when certain kinds of screws, this is a great tool. I can secure a lot of learning with a lot of students in a hurry if they're capable of moving that fast. Good tool. We need this in our tool chest. We need this in our tool chest. We need this in our tool chest. We need to know when to use them, under what conditions to use them. And somebody, I promise you, is going to come along with a better mousetrap. Somebody's going to come along with a better tool to secure that learning or those screws that'll be even better than others. However, sometimes though, I know for a fact that some of you have tried to turn a screw with one of these. A butter knife. Yep, I see you nodding your head. And it's not that you were evil for doing that. It's just the best tool that you had for that job at that moment. Now, do you need to use, sometimes, yeah, you need to. And if you're like my kitchen, you got some butter knives with a little bent end on the end of them there because you've tried to turn screws with them. But sometimes it's just the best tool that you have available to you. But you got it. You use what you got available to you. And then one more, at the expense of beating a dead horse, I'm almost certain that some of you have tried to turn a screw with one of these things. Can you see what that is? That is a dime. And you've tried to turn a screw, you've tried to secure the learning with a tool that is magnificently insufficient. But you tried anyway because it was the only thing you had available to you at that moment. It was the best tool that you had at your disposal. So my point is this: you and I as professionals, we have a toolbox. Data is a tool. It's a many-faceted tool. But we need to know what data to use, when to use that data, how to use that data, and we're always going to get more data. There's always going to be some new kinds of data that come onto our screen, literally on your screen, And we need to learn how to use that data, but always we need to do it in the context of, is this the data that I need to be using and I and the team that I'm working with need to be using to achieve the goals that we've chosen for this school or for these students? Let me get off that topic and move to some of your comments and thoughts. Many of you seem to really enjoy the Stevens Davidowitz video on the Google Analytics, particularly the story about President Obama's speech in relation to Muslims. Seemed to resonate with a number of you. A point I'd like to make about that is that after President Obama made the first speech and didn't like the way that it played, he came back and repackaged that message to better effect. It's worth, I want to point out for all of us, though, that President Obama didn't change his thinking or his position. All he did was change the way that he packaged the message. He realized that there was a better way to package the message to reach the audience that he was trying to reach with the message that he wanted to convey. So that's important for you and I to be very careful and thoughtful in the way that we're packaging our messages, and that's one of the reasons we went through. We're going through the week of. We went through the week of data stories, and those conversations are important. The way we package that data has everything to do with how effective we are in getting the interventions done. Something on the topic of Google, though, I read this a couple of years ago when I was a superintendent of a school and we got hit by the flu pretty seriously. In fact, right now, out in my part of the world, out here in the northern and western part of Texas, we've had numerous school districts that have had to shut down for 1 or 2 days because of flu. But I came across this a couple of years ago, and I thought it was very interesting, but it's in relation to that Google data and the Google Analytics. Google knows 2 weeks before the Centers for Disease Control where the flu outbreaks are. Let me say that again. Google knows 2 weeks before the United States Center for Disease Control knows where the flu outbreaks are occurring because of those searches that Stevens Davidowitz was talking about. Now, let me plant a seed with you and tease your brain a little bit. Because Stevens Davidowitz made some very interesting assertions in that video. Particularly his point, everybody lies, but his point is your internet activity probably is a truer indicator of what you're thinking. As I was listening to that and thinking about that, I was thinking, so could a campus or a school district with their website fashion it in a way, organize their website in a way, and then collect the hits in such a way that it would give them some good indications of where the highest needs and highest concerns of their clientele? It's something for you to think about. I suspect that there are ways to do that. I'm not sure I've seen a district do it yet, but I can promise you with the advent of augmented intelligence and artificial intelligence, I'm betting you good money that it's on the way. Caitlin, in the discussion forum, spoke to the reflecting about her changing view of being a teacher, shifting it from one of being the deliverer of information to more of one of being a facilitator of learning. And I invite you to consider that and think about that. I think she's right on point. In fact, a word that I've heard and one I really like to use, and I've tried to shift the way I teach along those lines, and you all are experiencing that, painfully or otherwise. But no longer do I feel like I need to be the smartest person in the room or the one that has all the answers. What my job is to be a curator of relevant knowledge and information and put it in a package and make it available to you from a wide array of sources, and then try to facilitate your thinking and your learning around that. And so what Caitlin spoke to is exactly the way I've been trying to reform myself as a teacher over the years. The human element of data is critical for you and I to think about. In our profession, and somebody made this point in the discussion forum, and I can't remember who it was. But I remember working in large campuses as a high school principal. We would be looking at data, and people would be, jumping to, forming conclusions around the data and making generalizations. And I remember repeatedly bringing them back to this fact: every one of those data points has a first name and a last name. They're not numbers; they are children. And the data that they are generating, they're generating for a wide array of reasons. Some of it's cognitive, some of it's emotional, some of it's biological, some of it's psychological. But they generate the data that they generate for a wide array of reasons, and so it's important. That's why you and I, as skillful teachers, need to know, make a professional assessment of where the children are or where the campus is, and then pick the tools that we think will help us achieve the goals that we set in a way that's meaningful, not only in the whole, but also for those specific children. Somebody put it like this a few years ago, and I thought it was a pretty nice way to think about it. They said, lawyers lock up their failures and doctors bury theirs, but we and educators and teachers turn our failures loose on society. And I thought that was an interesting way to frame that, and it kind of sobering, actually. We're shifting our conversation this week from data fallacies to data collection. You've already begun charging into that content a little bit. Somebody had made the point, and I want to reinforce it. I think you're aware that most of my service has been in the state of Texas, and so we've been under the dark cloud of standardized testing for about 20 years now, and for a number of years, the writing portion of that test was done in a very tight window of time. And for graders for that test in Texas, that high stakes test that third graders and fifth graders and eighth graders and 10th graders, all of them were taking, what they would do is they would hire people off the street that weren't even educators and pay them a minimum wage to grade those tests. And so as teachers, what often happens is you're looking for the shortest distance between point A and point B, and they found out, the education profession found out, that what those graders were being taught was to grade on a very strict formulaic view of the writing. So consequently, all the teachers that were teaching the writing to the students that were going to be taking those high stakes tests began teaching the students a very tight 5-pronged formula in order to pass the test. And so you ended up with hundreds of thousands of writing samples in the state of Texas. Most of them were being graded as proficient. But if you were to read those things, it would be remarkably uncompelling, uninteresting, unmoving. It's not the way writing could be and can be and should be. It was very formulaic in nature, and it was only writing that fits a certain specific kind of goal. If you were writing a letter, you would never write it that way. If you were writing an essay, you would never write that way. If you were writing a poem, you would never write that way. Even if you were writing a research paper, you would never write it that way. And so finally, some people at the state level began to reconsider the way they were doing that, and they modified it some. But my point is this: effective writing, and I think most of you, because you're graduate students, know that effective writing cannot really, except for the rarest of people, cannot be done in a very narrow window of time. You write it, you put it down, you think about it, you go back and edit, and then you add some thoughts and you take some away, and you put it down and you come back to it. And writing, effective writing, it goes through several versions of editing. It's hardly ever done where you sit down and you crank it out in a 30-minute window of time, unless you're trying to beat the deadline for your professor's submission deadlines. On the subject of data, I can't remember if I've brought your attention. This kind of goes back. One of my favorite writers and thinkers is a physician named Dr. Deepak Chopra. He actually, even though he's a neuroendocrinologist by training and trade, he's a real physician. He calls himself a witch doctor. But he tells us that the day is coming very soon where nanobots will be in our bloodstream, and they will be collecting data and generating data and even interpreting the data that they read to tell us the interventions that we need to take for a healthy body. Because as our conversations, especially when we think about the Stevens Davidowitz video, because we have such robust data collection tools and data aggregation and analytic tools, we get data turnaround at a much quicker rate. Some of you are probably, I'm almost certain some of you are using some pretty robust softwares right now in your classrooms. Accelerated math comes to mind, or IXL software comes to mind. There's different kinds that really can give you very quick turnaround on student performance and allows us to intervene for a student like Nelson if he has a poor if he does a poor job of decoding while he's reading, in his second grade. The teacher can identify that at a much quicker rate than they could have, say, 10 years ago. So it's powerful tools that we have at our disposal if we know how to use them. I've mentioned this to you last week, but I want to talk to you again about it on the topic of data, because at this point in most of your careers, you're thinking about data in relation to your classroom and to your specific children that you're teaching. But I want you to elevate your thinking to that of the leadership role. I think I keep putting a shadow on myself here. And think about the data that has to do not just with a specific classroom, but with a campus or with a department on a campus. Or if you're thinking superintendent work, an entire district. There's lots of different levels of data that we can be and should be. And I'll give you, for instance, one of the high schools I was a principal of, it was a large one. We had 64 adults that worked in the special ed department. Just in that on that one campus, in that one department, 64 adults that worked in that department. And that was one of the most effective departments and teams I think I've ever worked with. And they were, it wasn't because of me. They were already there before I got there. But in that particular special ed department on that high school campus, we collected data on if an ARD meeting started on time, if it started late, how many seconds it was late, if the administrator that was supposed to be there was on time, if they were late, how late they were, how long the meetings ran. We kept data on the efficiency of the ARD meetings themselves. And we would sit down and review that data. And as the campus principal, if I had an assistant principal that was habitually late to ARD meetings, then I would have a conversation with him or her and say, hey, we're serving our customers. They show up on time expecting a meeting, and that meeting cannot proceed without an administrator there, a decision-making administrator there. So it's important that you be there on time when you're assigned to those meetings. But that's the kind of data that we were collecting. I think I mentioned to you all before, and I talked about this a little bit last week, data that's actionable and data that's not actionable. There's all kinds of data that you and I can collect on a campus to detect the health and well-being of the campus. Certainly there's the student achievement data. There's also the data on the adult absence from duty. There's the data on, obviously, discipline. Some of you referred to that quite a bit in the discussion forum stuff. There's data on the stakeholder surveys. In some states, they call them comprehensive needs assessments. Almost every state requires you, in public schools, you do some sort of a customer satisfaction survey. As Stevens Davidowitz says, most of the time on surveys, people are lying to you, but it's still, we still need to try to gauge as best we can, get a finger on the pulse of the people we're trying to serve in order to serve them better. For instance, in the field of athletics, for years, we've been really pretty proficient in collecting certain kinds of data. For instance, if in baseball, coaches will study very carefully and determine the pitch location that a particular pitcher is most likely to place the ball as they throw it. And so they coach the batters to be looking for that ball coming on the outside of the plate or the inside of the plate or low and inside to heighten the likelihood of a base hit. In basketball, we study very carefully where particular players are most likely to score on the court. If they're going to hammer you from the three-point line, then you're going to play more aggressive defense out there. In track, for instance, if you got a distance runner, you train that athlete to know exactly if they're running the 1600, that means 4 laps around the track. And then the coaches go to great lengths to train those students to know how many seconds they should hit that first lap and how many seconds they should be at in the second lap and the third lap in order to optimize the performance of those athletes. I would submit to you that in the relation of the health and the well-being, what we now know, I'm kind of working in an analogy for you here. What we now know, and we haven't known previously, is that nutrition plays a critical role in the performance of athletes. Particularly, we now know that if a student will drink a glass of beet juice about an hour to 2 hours before an intense performance, they have significantly increased oxygen uptake capabilities. Let me translate that for you. It means they can run full speed longer without exhausting, or they can hold their breath. If they were a diver, they can hold their breath 20 to 30 seconds longer than they could otherwise, simply from drinking a glass of beet juice, which is not a performance-enhancing drug, although it's performance-enhancing. But we're learning more and more about that. The same thing goes for the data that you and I can use in schools to put a finger on the pulse of the health and well-being of those students. So you and I have to continually add tools to our tool chest and know how to use them. This is a fine tool. It works great on a square-headed screw, but if you didn't know that you could take that out and replace it with a different kind of bit, then you would be handicapping yourself as a leader and as a professional by not knowing how to use that tool completely. Caitlin and Kim and others have commented on the fallacies and perversions of standardized testing. And I don't want to beat a dead horse on that, but I've been there a long time. Years ago, I came to the conclusion that standardized testing was running us, making a perversion of what we were trying to get accomplished at school, that we really needed to be more in the business of the holistic education of the child. If you're interested in reading my thoughts, you can go to my website and look under the tab. It has my articles. I wrote an article. Actually, it was a satire that got published and the title of it was A Tale of an Absurd Accountability System. And it kind of relays my thoughts on that topic. College readiness is a subject that seems to have come up again and again. Particularly, some of you were reading I think it was the Iowa data that had the CRB thing, and you weren't sure what that was. College readiness, and somebody pinged in there, and I can't remember who it was. And the point they made, and I hear this point made a lot. Not every child is going to go to college. No, they're not. You're absolutely. In fact, I'm the oldest of four boys. My three younger brothers make more money than I do, and not a one of them went to college. So it's not about that. But from an education perspective, shame on you and me. Shame on you and me if we don't prepare children to be able to be successful at the college level, if that's what they end up choosing to do. Many of you, I'll bet you good money, many of you people have family members that got out of high school, maybe not even graduated, but at some point down the road, they decided, and some of you may be in this boat, decided, yeah, I think I will go to college after all, or technical school. But I fully agree that not every child is going to go to college, and I fully agree that not every child needs to go to college. But from an education, a formal education perspective, I feel that you and I are compelled to make sure that we have every child prepared as best we can for them to be successful, if that's the pathway that they choose. On the topic of reading improvement, a number of you have made some comments about text exposure. And more I'm seeing articles and now finally a little bit of research on the negative effects of screen time on young children and their ability to read. I think that's something that you and I are going to deal with more and more if in the field of education. Is most certainly we know that children that have been exposed to high levels of exposure to textual content by the time they reach school perform better in school. That's one of the big gaps that you and I have to try to fill for children that show up that have not been exposed to a lot of text. I think equal to that in the days and years to come, we're going to have a lot of kids that they can function on an iPad extremely well, but they can't read very well. And I'm not sure how we're going to deal with that. I think it's going to become. I think the research is going to become more and more convincing that there should be some pretty strict time limitations on the amount of screen time per day for children. Three book recommendations, and I'll take your questions. And these books they came to mind as the books I've read come across. I mean, I've read them over the years, but as I've read through your learning task submissions and also your discussion forum comments, these things came to mind. One of them is a book called, it's a great nonfiction book called Non-Zero by Wright. It's a powerful, and this book was written, I don't know, probably 2004 or 5 maybe. It's got a little age on it, but Wright made the point in that book that as technology increases and our interconnectedness through these kinds of media increase, the planet becomes more and more like a human brain, and it becomes more and more interconnected and interdependent. And even 10 and 12 years ago, whenever he wrote the book, he was predicting that multinational businesses would hold more sway on policy than governments. And I think we're seeing that play out right now. It's really a great book. Another one that comes to mind, in particular in relation to your job and mine as leaders trying to influence others and get others to rethink positions, is one of my favorite authors, Dr. Howard Gardner out of Harvard, and he wrote this book in 2004. It's really kind of out of his forte because he's very much a cognitive scientist and into learning theory. But he wrote a book titled Changing Minds, The Art and Science of Changing Our Own and Other People's Minds. It's really a good book, really influenced my thinking. I think it would be helpful for you and as you polish up your leadership skills and you on your leadership journey. Okay, I'm going to run out of gas. Well, I got more stuff I could say, but I'm going to shut up and let you all ask me questions. I did say, Amanda, yes, beet, B-E-E-T, beet juice. Yeah, believe it or not. Interestingly, I've got some, you may not care, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Some of you are familiar with the movie director James Cameron. I think he directed Titanic. And he directed that sci-fi. Oh, gosh almighty. Avatar. Yes, thanks, Aaron. The same guy. He's got a movie that's about to come out titled Game Changer about world-class performance athletes that eat nothing but plant-based diets. I read an article about that, and he made the comment that after getting some of the testimonials of those athletes while they were doing the background work on that, one of this is going to sound crazy to you, but one of the studies that they were quoting and they found was this. I'm going to soften this up a little bit, but the sexual prowess of the males that were on this plant-based diet, and it had such a profound impact on James Cameron's movie team that several of them immediately became plant-based eaters. But I haven't tried that out yet. I don't know. But does beet juice help with altitude sickness? I don't know the answer to that, Rebecca. That's a good question. And Aaron, don't suggest going and drinking a bunch of beet. No, Google it. Yeah, too much of anything is not great. Absolutely. But there's some very interesting research on that stuff. Other questions you got? You asked me questions about our course or our problems of practice, or if you got, I'll talk to you almost on any topic in the world. I have strong opinions on everything, almost everything. I'm going to turn my notes off right quick here where I can look at you. Whoa, we got a lot of you here tonight. Should have charged admission on this one. I guess we did charge admission on this one.
I have something about the internship hours.
Okay.
We really don't have faculty meetings.
Okay.
So how should I handle that? Because you in part of there it says to do part or whole of a faculty meeting.
Well, do you have department meetings?
We have teams.
Okay. Use those.
Okay, so we all just kind of have our own little jobs.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, use that. Anytime anything that would be the assemblage of a group of professionals to discuss the critical issues on the campus or the work that you're trying to get accomplished, that'll work. School morale, do you think it starts with administration? Rebecca, and you know, I'm an old athletic coach, and from my very beginnings, well, even back when I was an athlete, I began developing these thoughts. But I'm an absolute believer that attitudes are contagious. And one of the most prominent writers in the field back in the 1960s was a preacher named Dr. Norman Vincent Peale. He got much more famous for writing his books on the power of positive thinking than he did preaching. But the stuff still applies. I believe you and I, as leaders, have tremendous possibilities to influence the way the organization thinks and reacts and behaves. It has to start with our modeling, but it also, we have to adopt the kinds of language and the framing of the agendas and the conversations in the hallways that begin to impact. This is culture stuff. If you're in my PLC class, we're about to launch into a week of discussion on culture shaping, but it's all about culture. And most of that has to do with the way you and I teach the adults that we're working with. Thanks for that question. Other questions, if you got them. You know, I told my lovely bride, she's been watching me work, and she's a retired educator, but I've been telling her how, because I've taught in face-to-face environments and blended environment, I'm having so much fun working with you all. It is just so cool, because, I mean, literally, we're all over the planet. Literally, we're at every kind of school you can imagine, from correctional institutions to private schools, to charter schools, to residential school setting schools, to public schools, from the 9th Ward of New Orleans to little country schools on the border of Idaho and Wyoming. It's amazing the opportunity you all and I have to learn from each other from such a wide array of people. Aaron makes a comment, we can model appropriate culture and morale, but it won't make the culture completely positive. Correct, absolutely. I'm convinced of this from my study of culture shaping. There's a lot of good books on that. Bowman and Deal, Dr. Anthony Mohammed, tons of great works on culture shaping. But our best chance, you and I don't get to go in and say, by God, this is what our culture is going to be. All we can do is influence that culture. And so you and I may serve a school for 2 years. We may serve a school for 5 years. Some of you have been on the same campus for 12 or 15 years. But every day, with every conversation, with people watching how you spend your time, how you spend your money, and how you spend your effort, you can influence that culture. And the higher level title that you have, the more people are watching you. I'm absolutely convinced that attitudes are convinced.
Yeah, I feel like my point is that it's a necessary thing for you to be positive if you want a positive culture, but it's not a sufficient thing to have a positive culture just by being.
Agreed. Agreed. Yep, good point. Excellent point. Thank you. Anybody else got questions or comments? Well, I absolutely love learning with you and from you. I think you all figured out if you reach out to me, you're going to get a pretty quick response from me. So use me as you need me. And thanks for being here. Good night.